You keep ending up in the same relationship, just with different faces. The details change, but the dynamic stays identical. The slow erosion of your boundaries, the constant second-guessing, the feeling that you're always one mistake away from catastrophe. You tell yourself each time will be different because this person seems different. But 6 months in, you're having the same fights, feeling the same dread, wondering how you got here again. You're not unlucky in love. You're not broken. You're caught in a pattern you can't see because you're standing inside it. Most people spend decades cycling through variations of the same relationship without realizing they're following a script written in childhood. The person changes, but the play stays the same because you keep auditioning actors for roles you don't know exist. Understanding these patterns won't make them disappear overnight, but it will give you the one thing that actually changes trajectories: the ability to see the game board while you're still playing. Number 1. The pursuer-distancer dance. One person wants more closeness, more communication, more reassurance. The other person wants more space, more autonomy, more breathing room. The pursuer's anxiety triggers the distancer's withdrawal, which triggers more pursuit, which triggers more distance, and the cycle feeds itself until someone breaks. What makes this pattern so sticky is that both people think they're responding to the other person's behavior, when they're actually both responding to their own anxiety about intimacy. The pursuer learned early that love is something you have to chase and earn. The distancer learned that closeness equals suffocation. You can spot this pattern by the timing. Do fights happen right after moments of real connection? Does one person's vulnerability trigger the other person's sudden need for a boys' trip? The cruel joke is that pursuers often grew up with emotionally distant parents, and distancers often grew up with enmeshed, boundary-violating parents. So they're both running from the same thing in opposite directions. You can't fix this by meeting in the middle, because there is no middle. Someone has to recognize the dance and stop moving. Number 2. Trauma bonding versus actual intimacy. Trauma bonding feels like intense connection, but it's actually intensity mistaken for intimacy. You go through something difficult together, break up and get back together repeatedly, share secrets and vulnerable moments during crisis, and your nervous system confuses the adrenaline rush with love. Real intimacy is built during calm, boring moments when nothing dramatic is happening, and you still choose each other. Trauma bonds form when someone alternates between being your source of pain and your source of comfort, creating a psychological dependency that has nothing to do with compatibility. The relationship feels addictive because it literally is. Your brain gets hooked on the relief that comes after the pain, the reconciliation after the fight, the affection after the cruelty. This is why the worst relationships often feel the most passionate. You're not experiencing deep love. You're experiencing an activation of your nervous system's survival responses. The test is simple. Remove the drama and see what's left. If the relationship only feels alive during conflict and makeup cycles, you're trauma bonded. If you can be bored together and still feel connected, that's intimacy. Number 3. The relationship as self-abandonment. Some people are so focused on managing their partner's emotions that they completely lose track of their own. You become a mood reader, a behavior predictor, constantly scanning for signs of displeasure and adjusting yourself accordingly. This doesn't come from love. It comes from a childhood where your safety depended on managing an unpredictable parent's emotional state. The relationship becomes a stage where you perform a version of yourself, calculated to minimize conflict and maximize approval. You stop knowing what you actually want because you've trained yourself to only want what won't cause problems. The partner might not even be particularly demanding. You're responding to a threat that existed 20 years ago in a different house with different people. This is how you end up in relationships where you're technically getting everything you asked for, but feeling completely empty. Because the person being loved isn't actually you. You've optimized yourself out of existence. The relationship feels safe because you've eliminated all conflict by eliminating yourself as a separate person with needs. When someone says they lost themselves in a relationship, this is the mechanism. You didn't lose yourself. You traded yourself for the promise of stability. Number 4, anxious attachment, seeking avoidant attachment. The most common toxic pairing is the anxiously attached person who needs constant reassurance, paired with the avoidantly attached person who sees need as weakness. The anxious person's nervous system is wired to interpret distance as danger, so they pursue. The avoidant person's nervous system is wired to interpret closeness as suffocation, so they retreat. Both believe their response is the only rational one. The anxious person thinks the avoidant one is cold and withholding. The avoidant person thinks the anxious one is needy and suffocating. Both are right and both are wrong because they're speaking different nervous system languages. What makes this particularly cruel is that anxious people are attracted to avoidant people because the inconsistency feels familiar. And avoidant people are attracted to anxious people because their need for space feels justified by the partner's need for closeness. You're not choosing each other despite the incompatibility. You're choosing each other because of it. The relationship confirms both people's core beliefs about love, that it's unreliable and requires constant vigilance for the anxious person, that it's invasive and requires constant defense of boundaries for the avoidant one. You'll stay stuck in this pattern until one person does the hard work of shifting their attachment style, which typically requires therapy and a lot of time with a secure partner who won't play the game. Number 5. Codependency masquerading as love. Codependency is when your sense of self-worth is entirely dependent on managing someone else's life. You feel responsible for their emotions, their choices, their happiness, and you believe love means sacrificing yourself for their well-being. This shows up as constantly fixing their problems, making excuses for their behavior, prioritizing their needs over your own, and feeling anxious when you're not taking care of them. It looks like selfless love, but it's actually a control strategy. If you can manage their life well enough, maybe they'll stay, maybe they'll change, maybe they'll finally become the person you need them to be. The codependent person often grew up in a chaotic household, where they learned to monitor and manage unstable adults. And they bring that same hypervigilance into adult relationships. The partner often has addiction issues, mental health problems, or profound immaturity because codependent people are attracted to projects, not partners. The relationship can't survive health because the entire structure is built on one person needing rescue and the other person providing it. If the troubled partner actually gets stable, the codependent person often finds a reason to leave or unconsciously sabotages the progress because a healthy partner doesn't need them in the same way. And being needed is how they experience love. Number 6. Repeating your parents' marriage. You swore you'd never end up in a relationship like your parents had. And now you're in a relationship exactly like your parents had. Maybe you married someone like your father, and you're mothering them the way your mother did. Maybe you're recreating your parents' fighting style. Maybe you're performing your same-sex parents' role in arguments you watched 1,000 times growing up. This happens because your nervous system learned what love looks like by watching your first models. And that template runs below conscious awareness. You're not attracted to people who are good for you. You're attracted to people who feel like home. And home is whatever your nervous system imprinted on between ages 0 and 7. Even when you consciously choose someone different from your parents' dynamic, you often unconsciously recreate the emotional patterns. Your partner might look nothing like your father, but you still feel the same anxiety about abandonment. The relationship might seem totally different on the surface, but the underlying dynamics are identical. The only way out is to become conscious of the template and deliberately choose different responses when the old patterns start to emerge, which feels unnatural and wrong because you're working against decades of conditioning. Number 7. The narcissist's target. Narcissists don't pick strong, confident people. They pick empathetic people with weak boundaries who've been trained to prioritize other people's needs. The relationship starts with idealization. You're perfect and they're obsessed. Then shifts to devaluation once you're attached, then cycles between the two states to keep you destabilized. You spend the relationship trying to get back to how things were in the beginning, not realizing the beginning was a performance designed to hook you. The mechanism is simple: intermittent reinforcement. You get just enough good treatment, just enough glimpses of the person you fell in love with, to keep you hoping that if you just get it right, if you're just patient enough, loving enough, understanding enough, they'll go back to being that person consistently. They won't, because that person never existed. What you're calling a relationship is actually a con, where you're being trained to accept less and less while providing more and more. The narcissist needs supply, someone to regulate their sense of self, and you're auditioning for the role by proving you'll tolerate mistreatment in exchange for breadcrumbs of validation. The relationship can't be fixed because it's not actually a relationship. It's a one-person show where you're the unpaid emotional labor staff. Number 8. The fantasy bond. You're in love with who they could be, not who they are. You overlook the drinking problem because when they're sober, they're so charming. You ignore the anger issues because when they're calm, they're so attentive. You accept the lies because when they're honest, they're so vulnerable. You're in a relationship with potential, with the person you believe exists underneath the problems, and you're willing to endure the reality in service of the fantasy. This is different from optimism or patience. This is looking at someone showing you exactly who they are and deciding you know better. The fantasy bond feels like commitment, but it's actually a refusal to acknowledge reality. You can't love someone you don't see clearly, and you can't see clearly when you're editing them in your mind into a different person. The particularly insidious part is that occasional glimpses of the fantasy person keep the hope alive. They have one good week and you think they've finally turned a corner. They apologize and you think they've finally understood. You're addicted to the potential, not the person. The relationship you're trying to save doesn't exist. You're in love with someone you made up, and the real person standing in front of you is getting exhausted pretending to be your projection. Number 9. Why you keep going back. You know it's bad. Everyone in your life has told you it's bad. You've broken up 4 times. You have a list of red flags long enough to wallpaper a house, and yet you keep going back, and you can't quite articulate why. The answer isn't that you love them too much. It's that your nervous system has categorized this type of dysfunction as home. The chaos feels normal. The uncertainty feels familiar. The occasional good moment feels like winning, and your brain is wired to find winning more rewarding than consistent stability. When someone treats you well all the time, it doesn't trigger the same dopamine response as someone who treats you terribly most of the time and well occasionally. You're not weak or stupid for going back. You're fighting against neurochemistry and childhood conditioning. The relationship is probably replicating your earliest attachment experiences, which means leaving it feels like death, even though staying is killing you. Add in trauma bonding, sunk cost fallacy, and the human tendency to seek closure from the person who hurt you, and you've got a recipe for cycling back to the same disaster repeatedly. You stop going back when the pain of staying finally exceeds the pain of leaving and facing yourself. Number 10. Breaking the pattern. Reading this doesn't fix you. Understanding the pattern isn't the same as changing it. Your nervous system doesn't care about insight. It cares about safety. And for you, dysfunction feels safer than health because dysfunction is what you know. The work isn't in finding the right person. It's in becoming someone who can tolerate being chosen without sabotaging it. That requires therapy, probably a lot of it. Specifically with someone trained in attachment theory and trauma. It requires sitting with the discomfort of healthy relationships that feel boring compared to the chaos you're used to. It requires catching yourself mid-pattern and choosing different, even when different feels wrong. Most people don't do this work. They repeat the same relationship with new faces until they die or get too exhausted to keep trying. The ones who break the pattern usually do it after a particularly devastating breakup, when the pain of continuing finally exceeds the fear of change. You don't need a different person. You need a different nervous system. And building that takes years of consistent work with no guarantee of success. But the alternative is spending your life as an extra in someone else's damage. So you do the work or you accept the loop. Those are the options.